Hi, Bill.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available via both streaming video and audio podcast. You are William von Hippel, professor of psychology at the University of Queensland in Australia. You've written a book called The Social Leap, whose subtitle pretty much covers everything anybody would want to know. The subtitle is The New Evolutionary Science of Who We Are, Where We Come From, and What Makes Us Happy. Before we get into that, I want to thank you for getting up so early. In Australia, it is now 7 a.m. Is that true?
Yeah, that is true.
Now, when do you normally get up? What time do you normally get up? Should we be really flattered and honored that you're even vertical?
I love the idea of being really flattered and honored, but the truth of the matter is we have a lot of kookaburras and cockatoos outside our window, and they get up at 5:30, so I kind of get up.
So why
early.
fight it? You're always up at 5:30.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, then you've been up an hour and a half. It's about time you did something productive.
I'm trying to get to that, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the book. As I said, the subtitle covers a lot, including what makes us happy. I'm sure people would like to have the answer to that question. I think, you know, what you're writing about has relevance to other things that are some of which are in the news, like the so-called problem of tribalism. At least that's what it's being called here, the psychology of tribalism as manifests in America, particularly in, you know, intense ideological conflict. In other places, it might be sectarian conflict, national conflict, but I think to some extent you'd say some of the psychological mechanisms underpinning it are common to those different realms. So I want to talk about that problem, but why don't we start off with the book itself? First of all, I guess we could say that broadly speaking, you're in the tradition of evolutionary psychology. Is that fair?
That's absolutely right, yeah.
In fact, I noticed you wrote a paper with Bob Trivers, who made truly fundamental contributions to what became evolutionary psychology. In the 70s, he wrote a number of papers on reciprocal altruism, parent-offspring conflict, what he called parental investment. These are really foundational things. And you wrote a paper with him very, very recently that maybe we'll have time to talk to on self-deception, one of his big things.
Yeah, so I had the good fortune of meeting Bob at a conference, a very small conference around 2000, and then we corresponded for a while. And when he had the opportunity to go to Berlin to the Wissenschaftskolleg on sabbatical, he invited me to come along so we could write the paper and work together while we were there. So yeah, it was a great opportunity, and we've done a bit of empirical work since then as well.
Well, in my experience, every encounter with Bob is a memorable one.
I won't argue with that, absolutely. And in fact, the first person I met in the field was David Buss. It was the very beginning of my graduate education. It was the picnic at the beginning of the year when all the grad students meet each other. And David had just arrived from Harvard as a professor, and I just arrived as a brand new grad student. And he told me all about it.
Was this in Texas?
No, this is the University of Michigan. So he went from Harvard to Michigan, spent maybe 5 or 10 years there, and then he went to Texas. Okay. And he told me all about it. I said, this sounds like a ton of fun, but I would never get a job if I did this for a living. The politics of this are unpalatable to my field. And so I had other interests, which I thought I would pursue for a while before I eventually came out of the closet.
Maybe we'll have time to talk about that too, because you're raising an interesting question. I mean, there's been a lot of kind of political resistance to evolutionary psychology. I think we might agree that a lot of it was founded on misconceptions about what evolutionary psychology is. There was a stereotype that it was kind of a right-wing enterprise, in which case Bob Trivers' role would be ironic because he's like so far left. But at the same time, I mean, I don't want to get into the politics now. I would note that I've noticed lately that more than I might have imagined, a number of evolutionary psychologists are seeming kind of right-wing. I thought we can see if we have time to discuss this later.
Sure.
Does that resonate with you at all? Do you?
I think the evolutionary psychologists are very heterodox, and so when you look at the actual data, you see that they tend to be just as left as other academics, but they also tend to be very interested in not trying to be on the political left in their work. You know, they try to be
Right.
open to ideas from both sides. And so, lots of psychologists are that way. And I suspect that the lefties in evolutionary psych are a little bit more that way.
Yeah. I also think one thing that's happened is that one thing pretty much all evolutionary psychologists agree on is that males and females in many species, including ours, are not psychologically identical. And of course, here we're talking about aggregate kind of averages. We're not saying that, we're not being predictive about any individual male or female, but in the aggregate, if you look at the norms, there are differences in things like sexual psychology. And I think some of them have gotten so much blowback for that it has kind of put them, they have reactively become kind of enemies of social justice warriors broadly, or the perceived campus, activist left or something. And it's one of these weird dynamics. Well, we'll get to tribalism, but this is one of the dynamics of tribalism, right? Is like, once you define somebody as your enemy, then you start wanting to disagree with them about everything. Yeah.
It's a funny thing about our coalitional psychology that I signal my membership of my coalition in part by attacking yours, which seems unnecessary, but of course there's a good evolved reason for doing that.
Right. So we'll get to tribalism. Let's start with happiness, though. Let's start on a more upbeat note. And
Sure.
I guess to get to that, we have to say a little more about what you mean by the social leap. You're talking, I guess, about a critical part in our evolutionary history when we became, for example, very different from, say, our chimpanzee cousins. What do you mean exactly by the social leap?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, what the social leap is that event that took place basically over the first several million years. So it doesn't sound much like a leap when it takes that long, but nonetheless, over the first several million years after we left the rainforest. So some 6 or 7 million years ago, we left our chimp cousins behind, largely because the rainforest on the east side of the Rift Valley started to disappear. And with the geological upwelling on the east side, it raised up to about a mile high in many areas. Rainforest dries out, we end up with savanna, and you have these animals that are superbly adapted to living in the canopy, basically chimpanzees, who are now forced out to live on the open savanna. And so the question is, how do they deal with that? How do they survive? And what the data suggests, and what I believe, is that for the first several million years, all they did was kind of skulk around on the edges, trying to stay near the trees, avoid the big predators. But by 3.5 million years ago, we're now bipedal. And bipedalism brings something really interesting. It lengthens out your waist. It makes your musculature more lateral rather than vertical. And it makes your arms and wrists more flexible because you're no longer using them as a platform like legs to climb trees. And all that facilitates throwing. And throwing is the beginning of the single most important invention in military history, the capacity to kill at a distance. So once our ancestors gain that capacity, they gain something super important. And what that something is prior to that, a single large scary predator, even though it could be easily killed by, let's say, 100 of our ancestors who are armed with stones, many of them are going to die in the process. If you have to run up to a lion and bash it over the head, you know it's going to eat a bunch of you. But if you can stone it from a distance, now from relative safety, a larger force of weaker individuals can easily defeat a smaller force of stronger individuals. And so at some point along the way, from Australopithecines going forward a little bit, we developed the capacity to kill at a distance. All Australopithecines don't have it completely in place. By Homo erectus, all that lateral musculature that we now have that allows throwing is completely in place. And it seems like, chimpanzee ought to be able to throw really hard because they have, pound for pound, they're way stronger than we are. But because their muscles don't align right, and because they don't have that flexibility, they can't generate the elastic energy that we can generate when we throw. So human beings can throw way more accurately and with greater power than a chimpanzee can, simply by stretching all those muscles out in the rotation that's involved in throwing. And you need a flexible waist to do that, you need a lateral shoulders, and you need flexible arms and wrists.
So how widely accepted is this idea that the importance of throwing accounts for some distinctive parts of our upper body anatomy, A, and B, what other forms of empirical support might there be in terms of like anthropological data about how hunter-gatherers kill animals and so on? What's the status of this?
All right, great question. So, so first, at least since the mid '80s, with Barbara Isaac and others, they've been arguing strongly in favor of this throwing hypothesis. So, look, it's far from accepted. There's nothing in academics that we all agree on, right? That's our business. But many people believe that throwing played this critical role in human evolution. Now, the key in my mind is I suspect that throwing did very little except put the finishing touches on our anatomy. I think it was a byproduct of bipedalism. And so once you become bipedal, all these things come into place. And they then suddenly enable you to discover this new way of defending yourself. My guess, my belief is that goes back to Australopithecines. You know, we see with Australopithecines, after 3.5 million years in the savannah, we gained about 70 grams of brain power. So very, very little compared to our chimpish ancestors. But then going forward the next million years, when you get to Homo erectus, a little over 1 million years later, you've more than doubled your brain size. Now, there's lots of interesting genetic stories that might underlie that, but the question you have to ask is, well, why would evolution spend money on brain power at that point in time? Why didn't we develop it earlier or later? And for me, the answer is that, well, once you develop throwing, you also develop a new psychological imperative, and that is collective action. Because one Australopithecine throwing rocks at a lion is going to end up in the belly of a slightly bruised lion, right? You need 50 or more Australopithecines pelting rocks at the animal together. Now, chimpanzees are not good at working together like that. And so that would have required a shift in our psychology.
They do have small coalitions that do things like kill other chimpanzees and stuff, right?
They do. They work together very well when they kill other chimpanzees. They've never been known to cooperate in their mutual defense. They've never been known, well, they sort of do, but not in a planned action. It's just all a mad scramble. They do cooperate, so to speak, in monkey hunts, but in not a very coordinated way. Many of them just sit idly by and watch the thing happen. And they aren't good at cooperating for some sort of mutual benefit. And there's lots of lovely lab experiments that show that. And of course, there's lots of evidence in the wild. Again, there's disagreement about exactly how much that happens. But I would say fundamentally, they're more competitive to each other than they are cooperative. And when given the opportunity, they prefer to work alone. And for me, that's highly indicative. Humans do not prefer to work alone.
Speak for yourself. I prefer to work alone. But I take your point that we're very... we can be very richly cooperative. Now, there's a lot of people who would emphasize the role of cooperation in human evolution, the development of complex cooperation, its connection to language, who wouldn't necessarily buy the throwing hypothesis, right?
Assuredly. And for me, the throwing hypothesis solves one of the central problems of how did this all get going? And like what made us start to be cooperative? What made us start to do this? And there's lots of theories about what that might be. For me, the throwing hypothesis makes the most sense because using it in your mutual defense would solve the orientation problem. Why should we cooperate now rather than tomorrow or yesterday? Well, there's a predator coming toward us. This immediately attracts our attention. It's easy. You don't need enormous cognitive capacity in order to deal with that problem. But once you now get to this cooperative mindset, now the group goals and the individual goals start to align much better than they ever have in our line before that, in the great apes, etc. And so the consequence is now there's pressure to get smarter, because if I can get smarter, I can reap more benefits from cooperation, and so I can pay off the metabolic costs of bigger brains by hunting more effectively, doing all these sorts of things. And so in my mind, the reason that you see our brain power...
In other words, you mean you're getting the reward. You may need a lot of energy to do if you have a big brain, but the better you are at hunting, the more protein you're getting.
Yeah, exactly. So what's a zebra going to do with a huge brain? It's running around with hooves eating grass. It's going to be a pointless waste of energy. But if you look at our ancestors, once they start to work together, now a big brain is really beneficial. For every added ounce of brain power, I've got better group coordination. We can start to plan. We can start to have a division of labor. We can do the kinds of things that make our hunts more effective. And I can not only pay off that brain power, but I can even have a little extra energy to spare.
Okay. So now, if you look around at hunter-gatherer societies, and of course evolutionary psychologists, since, those of us who live in, say, where I live, are living in a very unnatural environment in the sense that this isn't like the environment we evolved in, and the environment we actually evolved in is gone, but the closest we can come to observing human beings in an environment like the environment of evolution is a hunter-gatherer society. So we often look at hunter-gatherer societies. But most of them, because technology has advanced, hunter-gatherer technology has advanced since the time you're talking about, most of them aren't. Are there many of them who are killing by throwing stones? I mean, they have spears and bows and arrows and stuff, right?
That's right. And so we have to rely on historical accounts. And Barbara Isaac, in her 87 paper on the throwing hypothesis, pulled together lovely examples of hunter-gatherers when Europeans first encountered them. Uh-huh. So, for example, when the first expedition to the Canary Islands to subjugate the locals, they met people who happened to not only throw, but basically their primary weapon was throwing stones. So hunter-gatherers have different weapons in different parts of the world. And the description of the stone-throwing event, here you've got these, I believe they're Portuguese, but maybe Spanish explorers in armor with crossbows and guns, and they're cut to pieces by the locals who have no armor whatsoever, and all they're doing is throwing stones. Mm-hmm. And that story has been repeated over and over. Here in Australia, as late as, that was in the 1400s, as late as the 1800s, they're writing about the locals cutting them to pieces just by throwing stones, because they could throw them so rapidly, with so much force, and so accurately that they were more effective than guns were all the way up until 100 and some years ago.
Okay, so let's. So this is a part of your worldview that's not shared by evolutionary psychology. It's not shared by all evolutionary psychologists, but a lot of the worldview you're presenting in this book is shared pretty broadly in evolutionary psychology, and I think that includes a lot of what you would invoke when you're talking about what it takes to make human beings happy. And certainly one of the things we've covered is cooperation. I think everybody pretty much agrees that cooperation, at least under some circumstances in our nature, we have a number of psychological mechanisms that are evolved. To facilitate that, and so on, right?
Absolutely. And so, you keep saying, and I think quite rightly so, that we often cooperate, but not always. And so in my mind, the pressures to cooperate are the intergroup pressures, the sort of tribalism side. It's cooperating against other groups and cooperating against predators, things that want to hurt us. And so threats to the group are enormous pressure on us to cooperate. And then the pressures that push us away from cooperation are the statist pressures within the group. Because sexual selection mandates that it's always important to be at least as good as most of the other members of your group, ideally a little bit better in some domains, so that you'll be chosen as a partner. So within any group of humans, you've got constant status concerns as everybody's trying to rise to the top of the local hierarchy, not necessarily consciously, but somewhere in their minds, so that they could be chosen as a mate. And then external to the group, you've got threats. Now, the threats that push us toward cooperation are way stronger than the threats that push us away from it. So mating concerns matter. They're of great importance. Reproduction is the currency of evolution. But there's lots of different ways that you and I can jockey for status. Maybe you're stronger than I am, but I'm better at making arrows, or I'm a better artist, or I sing better. There's many, many ways, right?
Probably all of those are true, but
definitely not the singing. But anyway, so but nonetheless, when other groups are an enormous threat to us. So if you think about the throwing hypothesis, once that we got throwing underway, once we get to Homo erectus, and we're now capable of division of labor and planning, so this is 1.5 million years ago, we're starting to hunt some very large animals. Well, then who are the big threats to us? They're no longer the predators on the grasslands that are larger and more powerful than us. Literally, they can't take us on anymore. The biggest threat to us is now other humans. And so what that means is that we have this evolved tendency to tightly rally around when we're ever under any sort of threat from the outside. So we naturally, immediately cooperate if we see the slightest hint of threat. And that force is way stronger than the force that pushes us apart and that makes us bicker with each other on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. So so does that have a moral so far as what we should do to, if we want to pursue happiness in a way that'll wind up being gratifying, what we've talked about so far?
Yeah, so for me, so what does that tell you about pursuit of happiness? Well, the first lesson, of course, is that happiness would have evolved for a variety of purposes, but one of the important purposes would be to make us feel good when we achieve evolutionarily important things, these evolutionary imperatives. And so to the degree that cooperation was an enormous evolutionary imperative. It was one of the factors in my mind that shaped us as we moved into the savannah and then reclimbed the food chain. Well, that means that cooperation is going to make us feel good. When we work together effectively, we're going to feel great. When we're in relationships trying to raise our offspring, we're going to feel great. And when we're just with our friends as an important member of a coalition, that's a sign of safety. And that's going to make us happy.
Okay. So social stuff is worth pursuing. There is seems to be a problem with happiness. Is that, I mean, as you said, gratification seems to have been created by natural selection or implanted in us by natural selection in order to get us to do its bidding. Now that can range from things like just eating food because we need nutrients, and animals that don't pursue nutrients wind up dead and they don't get their genes passed on. It can range to sex in a sexually reproducing species. You would expect sex to be gratifying. It can include these social things. But one thing you would expect happiness to be, which it seems to be, is fleeting, right? Because if after, having a meal, I just basked in the afterglow forever and didn't get hungry again pretty soon, didn't get motivated to pursue either food or some other goal, sexual goal, social goal, something, then I'm going to lose out to my neighbor whose genes are inclining him to be a little more recurringly ambitious and hungry, right? So there is, and a certain amount of Buddhism is founded on this observation of the impermanence of gratification. Yeah. And it is a genuine problem, right?
It's an enormous problem. And you're absolutely right that happiness to work as a motivator has to be fleeting. And so what that means is that I have to be working toward a goal. And then when I achieve that goal, I should feel this big rush of happiness. And then over time, it must go away or I'll never achieve another goal again. Now, what's so interesting is that if you look at the data, what motivates you to put in all that effort to achieve a goal? So think about the last major goal that you had and think about how much energy you put into achieving it, how long it took, and then how happy you were as a consequence and how long that lasted. Well, the working toward the goal is almost always a bigger process than the happy afterglow of when you achieve those goals.
Yep.
And I believe that the way evolution solved that problem is that it literally gives us these little happiness hits as we get closer and closer to our goal. Mm-hmm. And so because we're really good at simulating the future, to the best of our knowledge, we're the only animal that can do that can simulate alternative futures. Well, what that means is that we can have this complex goal in mind. We can see the 21 steps between today and when we achieve that. And every one of those steps that we achieve, we get a hit of happiness. Mm-hmm. And what's so interesting, the neuropsych data suggests that those hits are larger if the goal is a little bit uncertain. And that's evolution's way of working us towards something that, of course, we don't necessarily know if we're going to achieve. Mm-hmm. If it's a certain thing, the guaranteed reward of time X, then the hits along the way don't do as much. So in my mind, that's a fascinating way that we generate this internal happiness by saying, there's one of those steps gone. I'm a little closer to that goal. And that way we don't realize it, but the happiness itself does last longer than the efforts to achieve it because we get happier as we get closer. We then have this big hit of happiness if the goal works out as we planned, and then it disappears. Now, I would add that we also tend to have what John Cacioppo called a positivity offset, that we all need to be a little bit more exploratory than we are afraid. Something has to get you out of the cave in the morning, right? And so for all of us, we have this sort of slight degree that we think, the world's going to be a good thing. I'll go out and check it out and see if it has rewards for me today. Now, not everybody feels that way all the time, but what it does suggest is that we tend to have this baseline level of positivity / happiness that's above neutral, and then what we really seek are those great hits when things go our way.
Okay. So you're not as bothered by the problem I identified and that Buddhism identifies as some other people?
Well, first of all, it makes perfect sense. And second of all, it's not obvious to me that happiness would be as much fun if it lasted forever. I mean, you can walk down the street and you can see people who have mental illness who are giggling to themselves. Usually they're angry, but occasionally they're super happy. Yeah. And it looks like this kind of weird diluted state and unpleasant. Ed Smith used to say there's no preference function that's monotonic. And you don't want an orgasm to last forever, and you don't want happiness to last forever. Those things they'd be exhausting and they would be debilitating.
Yeah. I hadn't actually tried to imagine either thing. They seem so unrealistic. I mean, I guess, but wouldn't you, by definition, if you were happy forever, wouldn't you be happy with that? I mean,
I guess so. But for me, yes, a bit of happiness forever. But think about the way you felt when something really went your way.
Mm-hmm.
You were just bubbling over, right?
It's like unsustainable as a...
It's energetically unsustainable, and I think it's actually socially unsustainable. People don't want to be around you when you're just. I'm like, sometimes
there's that practical problem, I guess.
You literally have to suppress it sometimes when everybody else doesn't have it as good as you do.
It's funny. I don't know when exactly this is going to air, but we're recording this the day after Tiger Woods. I don't know if you follow golf at all, but
I did.
But this was an epic accomplishment. I mean, this guy had been wandering around in the woods for 11 years trying to find himself as a golfer. He was 11 years ago the greatest in the history of the game, and then suddenly his life falls apart. Blah blah blah. Yesterday he won the first major tournament since that time, and I was wondering, like, and when you saw him afterwards, he was like on cloud nine. And I was wondering, how long will this last? You know, because. Don't you think it's the case that some of the most accomplished people are people for whom the gratification fades the soonest? I mean,
well, that's a good question. I'm not sure if it fades the soonest, but I bet you that it drops the most. And so there's this great quote that Ted Turner says, look at any incredibly accomplished person and you're going to look at someone who has at least some levels of insecurity. Yeah. Because of course, if you're totally content with yourself, it's hard to put in the hours of practice. It's hard to put those things in. Now, I don't know Tiger Woods personally at all. And I do know that he's such a gifted athlete that it may well be that for him, it's much more fun than it is for the average person to practice because it's much more rewarding. So, but nonetheless, if I think about myself, I couldn't motivate myself to just practice some of these tedious motions over and over again because the hit for happiness wouldn't pay off that huge amount of effort that went into it at the front end. So you'd need to enjoy the process more, or you'd need to have real depths that you're worried you might fall to.
Yeah, I don't know what the motivation is in his case, but one more thing about him, the day before the final round, the starting times had been moved up because they were expecting rain. So he was going to tee off at 9:20. And they said, what time are you going to wake up tomorrow to start getting ready for that 9:20 tee time? And he said, 3:45. I mean, you know, he said, you got to start getting the body as old as mine and shit. And I just thought, oh man, I don't think there's anything I'd get up at 3:45 for, but for him every day, I'm sure is that discipline. Okay, enough about him. I guess I mean, do you try to distinguish among different kinds of happiness by to what extent, you know, by how fleeting the happiness is? I mean, in other words, you know, junk food famously, like, you know, really sugary donut or something, feels great. Doesn't take long if you want more. And in fact, if it's a lot of sugar, maybe if you'd even feel terrible, who knows? Social gratification is a little different. If I say, I don't golf much anymore, but say have a great round of golf, not that the golf is great, but it's with friends and there's, you know, and there's fellowship and all that, that leaves you don't really notice the distinct falling off of that pleasure. So there's you know, there's a real afterglow. And can we divide our pleasures up in that way and choose among the ones that are most worth pursuing?
Look, I think we can. On the extreme junk food end of the continuum, you have what Trivers calls phenotypic indulgences. There are things that kind of hijack the system that we evolved in order to achieve what's in our genes' best interest, but they don't really do it. They just mimic it. So the example I like is you can actually have friends, which are super valuable evolutionary, or you can watch the TV show Friends, and they can be your friends, your pseudo friends, right? That's a phenotypic indulgence. You feel like you're part of the party, but you're not. A donut is a phenotypic indulgence. In our ancestral environment, it was hard to get sugar. It was attached to fruits and things that are quite good for you. Donuts aren't. So those things are going to crash pretty hard. On the other end of the continuum is the extreme version of what you were just saying about your fellowship with your fellow human, with your friends. Mm-hmm. And the case there, my favorite example is data from Richard Lucas looking at these long-term social projects in Germany where they can track marriage. And there, when they do that, they look at a couple of interesting things. First, they find that people who stay married, because now they can track people for a very long time. So they look at you before you ever got married, before you even met your partner, and then way down the road. And when they do that, they find that people are going to get divorced actually start out less happy than people who are going to stay married. So first of all, we know that there's a benefit to being a happier person. It makes you more likely to stay together in the first place. But now you can track those marriages and stay together. And what you find is that the happiest day they have is year, it's really divided by year, is the year they got married. That's like a peak moment for them. And then it very, very slowly comes back. And 7 or 8 years later, it's still a little bit above where it was 5 years before they got married, but just barely. So already we've got some evidence of the very, very long-term benefits of good social relationships. Because, of course, your partner is in front of you every day, and so you're getting little benefits every day. But what's super interesting is then Lucas goes into it and he looks in those data, the people who stay married, and it won't surprise you to learn that some of them probably shouldn't have. They're staying married for reasons other than the happiness that the relationship gives them. Mm-hmm. If you look at their data, they look a lot like the people who got divorced. In fact, sometimes worse. Their happiness goes way down. If you look at the average data, the people in the middle, they're exactly what I just said. But if you look at the top third of the people, or about a standard deviation up there, what you find is actually not only does it not tail back down after the year of marriage, it keeps going up for years and years. And so people who are in a really good relationship, a partner who really matches them well, they keep getting happier and happier over time. So I would say that the one thing that evolution gave us is the capacity to benefit from good, close relationships, because nothing was more important to our ancestors for their reproductive success and for their longevity than being in these good, meaningful relationships. So those are the one cases, that's the kind of happiness that when you pursue it, it actually lasts potentially permanently.
Mm-hmm. Could the causality be working in both directions? In other words, if things are going well for both of you, you're happy. So yeah, you're fine. You're fine with your marriage. You're fine with everything. Your career went well, and so on, right?
It probably all does interplay, but the key thing that we can see is that these people 5 years before they met their partner look just like the same people who 5 years before they met their partner, it worked out great, but it's not like over the moon. Mm-hmm. And so they're happier people. They still get happier at their wedding day, but then they just keep getting happier and happier. Now, for all we know, jobs going great, kids are going great, all those other things. But the one marker we have is the quality of their marriage. And so even if those other things aren't as great, we do know that marriage is playing a role.
Now, do you sense much of an affinity with positive psychology? Because, you're familiar with that kind of movement within psychology. Martin Seligman is one of the big names. And the idea generically is just that psychology should do more than cure psychologically sick people. It should also be able to tell people who don't have a particular malady how they can lead richer, happier, better lives. And one of the things they emphasize is community, right? Is social relationships, family, having a sense of purpose in the sense that maybe you're part of a group that's pursuing some goal and so on. Have you paid much attention to their literature and what they're doing?
Look, it's a great literature. It's super interesting because I think Seligman was right that we need to pay more attention to it. Now, of course, some people have been doing so for a very long time. Ed Diener is a great example. He'd been working on happiness back when it was considered an absurd topic to be studying for psychologists and completely non-serious. And really, if you think about it, that work is super important. If you're a society that's struggling and you're trying to provide for the basic needs of your citizens, you're going to worry a lot about the dark side. And, well, how can we cure people of mental illness? But if you're a society that's well-to-do, you should be focusing a lot on the other side of that coin as well. And, well, what can we do as a society to actually make people happier? And people in the United States have this vision that they're the happiest country on earth. But, of course, they're not anymore. Now, maybe they never were. They've certainly been a happy country for a very long time, but there are happier countries on this planet, and there are things about the United States society that can make it economically successful, but they can make it harder to be happy there. And inequality is a good example. It tends to lead to overall lower levels of happiness in the society when you've got great deals of inequality, partially for the reasons we were just discussing earlier, that inequality is a status threat, harder to get a mate, etc., but also when there's high levels of inequality, you start to lose interpersonal trust. You start to lose people's willingness to be vulnerable to each other. And those kinds of things are crucially important for cooperation.
Okay. And what do you advise about the pursuit of status on a day-to-day basis? Because that's really, although we talk about socioeconomic status, the question of economic inequality is a little different from the question of a person's day-to-day quest for status, because they're not on a day-to-day basis. They're comparing themselves to their peers, not to people who are a lot richer than them or a lot poorer than them, but people at work, people in the neighborhood, whatever. And I mean, two things about status. One is, of course, as with everything, the gratification you get from affirmations of your status will fade. But the other thing is, it's like a zero-sum game, right? I mean, if you just place someone on the totem pole, your gain is their loss. And that's not always true. Like when you talk about community broadly, if you've got 4 people wandering around in isolation and they all come together and form a community, that's a win-win game, right? Whereas status is a zero-sum game. So just in light of all this, do you have any guidance on like status? Should I quit pursuing it? It's a little late. I've been trying. I'm pretty habituated to trying, but
yeah, we all do, and we can't help ourselves. But I would add 2 things. First, status concerns meant we're a lot more sensible when we were in a group of 20, 30, 40 people, because I could rise to the top in some domain. And then that was it. My world was full. There were no other humans that I would interact with on a daily basis, and I didn't own a television. But nowadays, we literally have 7 billion people that we can compare ourselves to. And that, I think, is the source of this hedonic treadmill, where you get on it, you out-achieve the Joneses, and then you reset your sights on the Smiths, because there's always going to be somebody wealthier than you. And even when you get to the top, some new invention will come along, and then there goes the next person. Yeah. So it's unachievable. But the second thing I would say, and uniquely unachievable in our modern world, the second thing I would say, though, is that the good thing about being a human is that there's many ways to achieve. So if you're a dung beetle, literally you've got one thing you've got to do in life, and that's roll a big ball of poo, impress the female dung beetle that you've got this huge resource, and then you can mate. That's it. If you're not big enough and strong enough to roll the poo, you're out of the game. If you're a moose knocking heads, you can't knock the other moose down, you're out of the game. But as a human, there's many ways to achieve these status concerns. If you're stronger than I am, maybe I'm kinder than you. If you're richer than I am, maybe I'm more clever than you. If you're, you can just go on and on. I'm a better friend. I'm a better arrow maker. I'm a better artist. There's a million ways to do that. And so for me, what I try to focus on is, well, all right, what are my unique patterns of strengths? And we are naturally attracted to our strengths. Even from childhood, we are naturally drawn to those areas where we can positively distinctify ourselves from others. And so in my mind, the route to happiness is just really a reminder of what your unique collection of strengths are, and the fact that those make you, a worthwhile and valuable humans to others around you.
Okay, so find your niche.
Yeah, it'll never be money unless you happen to be Zuckerberg. For all the rest of us, that's a bad idea.
I'm not sure I'd that all the money's worth the blowback he's been getting.
No, it's a costly thing, but the thing is that we make the huge mistake of thinking that money matters so much. Mm-hmm. And the data show very clearly that once you get to the middle class, so your basic needs are met, money leads to a very small increase in happiness, whereas relationships and all those other things lead to a very big increase.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you alluded to some differences between the modern environment and the environment that natural selection kind of designed us for as it pertains to status. More broadly, that's a whole kind of subject. I mean, sometimes it's called mismatch theory, the idea that we live in an environment that is a mismatch with human nature. It's not the environment we were designed for. How big a problem do you think that is? It's things like chronic anxiety are sometimes attributed to that, unipolar depression, and so on.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do believe it's a problem, because there's no question that we evolved to live in an environment that's very different from the one we're in. But, everything is trade-offs. And if you look at the world right now and you rewind the tape, even just 30, 40 years, what you're seeing is the entire world is becoming more individualistic. So some countries are more collectivist, some countries are more individualistic. And as we move to cities, as our societies become more multicultural, a natural consequence of that is moving toward individualism. Well, that has costs. People don't look out for each other in their group quite as well as when they're individualistic as they do when they're collectivist, but it has enormous benefits. And it's much easier for people to move toward individualism than it is to move back toward collectivism. When you talk to people who've lived a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, there's many positives, but it's also this enormously oppressive communist regime where everybody's in everybody's business all the time, and where you've got no choice but to share any extra that you have in anything. And so there's these lovely interviews with these older members of hunter-gatherer communities who will say things like, I'm tired of sharing everything I own. I was given this, or I made this, and I just want to keep it. I don't want to give it to anybody. And so we forget that, yeah, they've got this great connection to each other. They don't worry about the anomie that we might feel in a big city, particularly when we're all alone, but they've got everybody in their business all the time. And it's this big brother society, as if there's a webcam in every home. And we do value our privacy. And so, yeah, I think the modern world has created some disconnections for us, but it's created some amazing things that, in my mind, at the very least counterbalance it, and in all probability far outweigh it. We may not have more leisure time than they had. That the data are a little bit, people argue about that point, but we've got lots more interesting ways to entertain ourselves with the leisure time we have, to engage our minds, and we have got a much bigger community where we can find like-minded individuals. If you're an odd duck and you live in a group of 200, 20 or 30, well, you're a really odd duck. But it's not possible to be an odd duck in today's world. You can find a club of people who feel exactly the same way that you do.
That has its pros and cons, actually. I mean, extremists. You can share a hatred with only a small number of people around the world, and you can hook up with them. There's apparently a subculture of people who are like convinced they're being followed, or that somebody's implanted brain chips, and they're now like together, like giving each other reinforcement. And I guess if they're not hurting anybody, maybe more power to them. But these things do have pros and cons. So let's talk about the thing I alluded to, the so-called psychology of tribalism, the polarization in America, the ideological polarization, the various kinds of conflict in the world that grow to some extent out of the dynamics of group psychology, right? Of how we identify with groups, how we seem to be in some sense naturally groupish. What is your take on, first of all, are you seeing this in Australia? The reason I ask is because it's sometimes the extreme nature of it that we've seen in recent years is sometimes attributed to technology. And if to the extent that that's the case, I'd expected to see it everywhere there's social media and the internet. But what do you think look like?
It does look a little bit different here. So I grew up in Alaska, and I spent my early adulthood in the U.S. I moved here almost 20 years ago. After I was teaching at Ohio State University at the time, and when we moved to Australia. And so I'm obviously very familiar with the U.S. system, and after 20 years, I've become very familiar with ours. And certainly things like technology can play an important role. So we've done some work, for example, where we joined internet hate groups, and we just watched the way that they band together in ways that it's hard to do. If you're a neo-Nazi and there's no internet, it's hard to find fellow neo-Nazis in a world where they're not popular. You can't go to the middle of a parking lot and say, my white brothers gather to me, because you're going to get far more negative reactions than positive ones. Even if there is somebody out there who'd like to come to you, they can't do that in that public setting. And the internet creates that virtual reality where all sorts of evil can hide and can get together and then provide a virtual community that pumps each other up. And the data suggests that that's what they do. So that's a problem everywhere. But what I would say is that the extreme partisanship that is currently on display in the United States, we don't see in Australia. And there's arguably several reasons for it. But I suspect that the most important reason for that is that voting is required here by law. And so in America, you can win elections by sort of fighting a primary that almost nobody shows up for, and therefore by being as extreme as possible and appealing to the people who are out on the edges who care enough that they'll go to the polls. Here in Australia, that doesn't happen.
So everyone has to vote? I mean, do they have the equivalent of primaries, first of all, as well as the general election?
No, we don't. And so it gives the party more power. They choose their person that they're going to put up. But, of course, they know, just like Americans know, that in the general election, you need to play more to the center. But even in America, you don't need to play to the center in the general election nearly as strongly as you do here, because here everybody votes. And so, if people's attitudes tend to be on a bell curve, then the winner of that election is going to sit as close to the middle of that bell curve as possible, but be a little bit on one side or a little bit on the other. In America, given that most people don't vote, you want to play to the bell curve of the people who will go to the polls. And those tend to be two non-overlapping distributions of right and left. Yeah. So the absence of mandated polling allows you to create a society where it's run by people who have the most extreme opinions, because even though most people are against X or in favor of Y, they don't care enough as the people who care, who X or Y is central to their world. So gun control or abortion or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, well, there's two things going on. So our general election, the electorate might be more heavily populated by people with intense views than your electorate. But there's also the fact, as you noted, that we have a primary season, and that intensifies this dynamic really for two reasons. I mean, it's an even smaller percentage of the population voting, so the even more relatively intense. And then that kind of, anyway, you see the problem.
Absolutely.
And in fact, in America, until 50 years ago or so, it wasn't such a problem because there really weren't primaries. The party, everything was done in a smoke-filled room.
And so that has pluses and minuses like everything else, right? And the one thing I would say is that the other cost of America right now is that it's a very multicultural society that was always pulled together by virtue of its competition with another society.
Right.
And in my childhood, that was the Soviet Union. Well, that competition disappeared really when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union broke up. And so that existential threat, that other country that could really potentially overpower us as Americans, disappeared. Now, the rest of the world, so here you have this one ascendant superpower and lots of other countries that aren't as strong. There's no outside force that serves as a threat that brings people together when they're having these status concerns. And so rather than seeing the enemy on the outside as their biggest threat, they see the enemy on the inside who has a different agenda as their biggest threat. And you saw that most notably in the current case where the possible Russian interference in the U.S. election, which would have been an enormously big deal when I was younger, was poo-pooed by half the population because it benefited their candidate, and the Russians are seen as less of a threat than the other political party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed you wrote a paper called Evolutionary Psychology and Global Security. I didn't read it. I'm not even sure the full text is available online, but I saw the title and it reminded me of kind of what you just said. I mean, I'm not sure what you say in the paper, but it does seem to me one problem we face with issues of a global nature that people, not just climate change, but I think there are a lot more of these kinds of issues than people recognize. Arms control in various realms, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, and so on, space weapons, cyber war. There's all kinds of things you'd like to see global laws and norms developed about, at least some of us would. But in the absence, the threats we face, like global warming, you can see that is a common peril, but it doesn't have the galvanizing effect of an actual enemy like the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so global warming we all argue about because my bread might be buttered literally for the rest of my life by treating it as if it's not true. And if my bread is buttered by not believing in it, well, that's human nature. I'm going to be less likely to believe in it. Whereas if I'm going to be attacked tomorrow, then whatever I do for a living has to be set aside. And the clearest example we have of that recently is 9/11, where Bush's approval ratings were hovering around 50%. And literally immediately after 9/11, they shot up to over 90%. And if you sat back and thought about it logically, you'd say, well, he was in charge when this bad thing happened. If anything, I should say he's less popular because it could be his fault at some level. But of course, the exact opposite happens. When our group becomes attacked, we all rally around the flag. We rally around our leader because, we may not agree about lots of things, but we all have to be on the same page about dealing with an enemy. And so we immediately have this psychological tendency to share our emotional views, to share our beliefs about the world, and to try to be as unified of a front as possible.
Mm-hmm. So one thing this gets at is what was, in terms of the way our brain processes reality, what is it designed to do? How is it designed to process it? Are we, the paper you wrote with Bob Trivers has the word self-deception in the, and I should say the other author is Megan K. Smith, has the term self-deception in it. And so the question arises, and I know you talk about this in the book. I mean, to what extent is it even natural for us to see the world clearly? And to what extent is this a problem to what extent is this a part of the so-called psychology of tribalism problem?
Yeah, it is. And so what I believe the best arguments are is that we didn't evolve to be accuracy machines. We evolved to be persuasion machines. And the reason for that is let's just take self-confidence as a for example. Here I am in the small group of individuals, and let's say my value to the group is I'm a 70 on a 100-point scale. So I'm not bad, but I'm not as high as I'd like to be. Well, if I want to persuade you to join up with me and you're a 90 or an 80, I want to believe that I'm higher on the scale so that I could try to convince you I'm higher on the scale. Or if I'm trying to get, let's imagine you and I meet and are arguing over a resource. If I want to get you to back down and let me have the resource, then again, I want to believe that I'm a little bit better than I really am. And so what would facilitate my ability to persuade you? Well, the more that I truly believe whatever it is that I'm trying to persuade you of, the more capable I'm going to be of getting you to see it my way. And so what that means is that even though we introduce a cost whenever we deceive ourselves, whenever we see the world as it's not, sometimes the benefits outweigh the cost. Because if I can get you to see the world as it's not, but in a way that's favorable to me, then I benefited even though I don't fully understand what the world is really like. Mm-hmm. And so we evolved not to be able to hone in on the truth, but rather to use our incredible cognitive machinery to find a way to persuade you of a truth that I regard as favorable. And so you can literally have two sides of a political debate, of a religious debate, of anything you want, and after they encounter the same information, you'd imagine as a proper Bayesian, well, you'd both move a little bit together because you're all seeing the same data, and those data probably lie somewhere between your two positions. Well, no, people actually move farther apart because they extract the pieces of data that are consistent with what they want the world to be, and they dismiss or ignore the other data. And so the unfortunate consequence is that you'd think that as we enter this internet world, we all have access to the same data now. The two political parties should come together. Everybody should agree on the exact dangers of global warming. Choose your problem. We should come together. The exact opposite happens. We move further apart.
Okay. And so what do we do about it?
It's super duper hard to fix. And the one thing that I would say is my colleague Matthew Hornsey has some really lovely data that show the key to try to persuade people of things that you think are important is not to just keep drumming home the same data. Like, as a scientist, we'd say, well, if I want to persuade people about global warming, I just show them more data about global warming. Look, if that was going to work, it would have worked 10 years ago. It's just not going to work. What you have to do is say, all right, well, let me see what are the roots of those attitudes. Why don't you believe it? And then let me find a way to address the roots of those attitudes. And in the case of global warming, we have people on the right who tend to say, well, this is a threat to business. It's going to introduce more taxes. It's going to be costly if I try to account for the carbon dioxide emissions. And they tend to be the people who don't believe it on average. And so what Hornsey's shown is that, well, what you have to do is say, look at all the business opportunities in solar. Look at all the business opportunities if we can get out in front in these clean energy things. And then suddenly, without even ever mentioning the word global warming, people who tend to be on the right tend to say, oh, global warming actually may be more likely than I thought. Because there's money to be made there. It's not that they're hypocrites and we're not. We're all hypocrites. The thing is that we have to find ways to make people see that the world is as it is in a way that will also benefit them.
Mm-hmm. Do you work at, I don't know where you are ideologically, but do you work at trying to spot the biases that as manifest on your own side, like of the arguments? And are you often disappointed in your ideological soulmates?
So those are great questions. I'm your typical academic lefty. And so I try really hard not to let that influence the questions I ask and the answers that I arrive at. And I fail constantly. And so I fail in the exact same way that I fail when I design an experiment to test my hypothesis. And I think, boy, that's a super convincing experiment. And then I always present it to a lab group of people who don't necessarily agree with my hypothesis. And they see Swiss cheese. There's holes everywhere. And sometimes they're wrong, like they just haven't thought it through enough. But very often they're right. Because the experiment that tests my idea in my mind, I already believe the idea. So I have a very low standard of the evidence that I need to test it. We have to create what we call these adversarial collaborations, where we talk to people who don't agree with us. And the exact same thing holds in the case of ideology. And I've got lots of examples where I've read a paper that supported my left-wing views, and I thought, wow, what a great paper. And then someone came along and attacked it and pointed out the emperor had no clothes, and I'm embarrassed to admit that I never even saw it, even though it's dead obvious. And so what that tells me is that we need a heterodox academy. We need, for science to work, especially social science where we're studying us, we need people who feel all over the map on the ways that society ought to be run.
Now, you use the term heterodox academy. That's an official thing, as I'm sure you know, right? Are you a member?
I am a member, and the people who started are old friends of mine. And as soon as they started it, it was again like, oh, what a great idea. The great ideas in science are almost always obvious as soon as you hear them. Like you never would have thought of it, but then as soon as you hear it, you go, of course. So Trivers' ideas all work like that for me. As soon as I learned them, I was like, of course, that explains everything. And I berate myself for not thinking of it, but of course, it's a lot easier in hindsight, right? And Heterodox Academy is another example. It's super important.
So you mean John Haidt, or who are the people who started?
John Haidt is one of the major players. Lee Jussum. These are all people. John and I happen to go to college together. Lee and I happen to go to graduate school together. So the people I've known for a long time.
I see. Because the Heterodox Academy, I mean, we should say it's a group of academics who, how would you characterize its official mission? Actually, you do it, not me. Because I think it's perceived as being kind of right-leaning. Right.
Well, it's perceived as being right-leaning because we're so crazy left-leaning. So to give you an example, David Buss and I ran a study where we're interested in why people in my field, social psychology, don't like evolutionary psychology. And so we surveyed, there's about 1,000 members of our lead society, and we sent surveys out to 900 of them because a few of them were in administration or elsewhere. And of those 900, over 300 responded. So we've got a great sample. So we have 309 people, and this is right after the Obama-Romney election. So Obama's a pretty left of center, and Romney's a little tiny bit right of center, right? For a Republican, he's pretty centrist. And we said to those 309 people, who did you vote for in the last election? Well, it was 305 to 4. Literally, in my society, 4 human beings voted for Mitt Romney. And so, yes, Heterodox Academy looks crazy right-wing to a society where there's no right-wingers, where there's barely any moderates. When we look at the political data, we're almost always way to the left of center, and maybe 1 or 2% of our society is centrist. Now, I'm a bit left of center, but I value, even if just to use these people, I value the utility of having people around who are right of center. And so that's the goal of Heterodox Academy, to allow voices on both sides of the academy to speak, not only to give us a better chance of finding the truth, but to make sure that everybody feels comfortable in the academy. Because we do know there's interesting data that show psychologists in my field will literally say, yes, I would be biased against somebody who is a right-wing person. I wouldn't want them in my department, et cetera. And that's a very bad situation. You want people of all ideological stripes. Diversity is not just about skin color, language, and religion. Diversity is about ideas. And for science to work, you need diversity of ideas, particularly social science. If you're a chemist, maybe it doesn't matter at all. But if you're a social scientist, it matters a great deal.
Yeah. Of course, in the day-to-day realm where the problem of the psychology of tribalism shows up, like on social media and so on, as you mentioned earlier or suggested earlier, diversity is not enough. I mean, you encounter a version of the opinions of people who disagree with you, but I guess sometimes you're not getting diversity. Sometimes what's happening is you're seeing the version of their ideas that are most easy to ridicule, and somebody in your tribe does a good job of ridiculing them, and that's what makes you aware of them. That's what spreads them. In fact, that's a pretty common dynamic. But I would also say, even when you work to follow, like on Twitter, people of a contrary ideology, in my experience, you're still not really warming up to them very readily. I mean, I'm just saying we do face the problem that encountering not only ideas contrary to yours, but even data contrary to your ideas, by virtue of human nature, doesn't necessarily have the desired effect.
No, it doesn't. It's super hard. And so the good thing about being in a scientific discipline is that we're forced to confront the data. We can't just poo-poo it because they've got finding X and we've got not X, and we now need to see, well, how do we bring these two ideas together? And the adversarial collaborations make some of the most important contributions in science, but they're some of the rarest collaborations because we literally don't want to work with each other. Now, the irony is that these might be two theories that from the outside look identical, like nobody on the planet would even see them as different, but inside you become highly expert in the nuance and you see that theory as ghastly and your theory as holding a beautiful truth. And so we fight, increasingly squabble harder over less, so to speak. But with that said, lots of the things that we argue about are of central importance. They do have important implications for society. Is social media bad for you psychologically? Is it beneficial to encounter contrary ideas under what circumstances? There's lots of things that we work on that are of central importance. And it's no surprise that we hold these views very close and dear to our heart. And it is the case that people do try to engineer societies based on them. So, Karl Marx sent the world in the wrong direction with his belief that we could have from each according to their needs and to their abilities and to each according to their needs. Hunter-gatherers can do that in immediate return societies, but humans haven't been able to replicate that ever since because it's a misunderstanding of our psychology. And so for me, understanding our evolution is super important because if you want to engineer society, if you want to make it a better place, and by the way, it's gotten better dramatically every year of our lives, well, then you want to understand it as much as possible.
Okay. And by the way, of course, social psychology has been undergoing something of a crisis by virtue of the kinds of cognitive biases we're alluding to. A lot of the experiments are not holding up to replication, and so on. And so that field is kind of sorting through this now. So before we wrap up, let's get back to your book, and let me just ask you, what major things would you like to highlight that you think we haven't highlighted?
Look, I think we've done a nice job going over, but I guess what I would say is that the goal of the book is to say, well, where were we and how do we understand our past? And I spend the first chapter on the first few million years. The next chapter takes us from kind of Homo erectus up to agriculture and works our way through that. And then that's the first few chapters of the book. But then really, as you said, the rest of the book is about, well, how do we understand the way we are today? And really what my goal is to say, well, how can we use our past to get a better understanding of our present? And how can we actually leverage that knowledge to plan going forward and make it better still? And so hopefully it's a fun book. Hopefully it's the kind of thing that you learn cool things about where we used to be, and it gives you a new perspective on where we are today.
Okay. And the book is The Social Leap, the New Evolutionary Science of Who We Are, Where We Come From, and What Makes Us Happy. Where can people find you on the web? Are you on, do you have a website? Are you on Twitter?
I'm not a very good web presence. I do have Twitter, but I'm a lurker. I like to follow and find interesting papers from my colleagues. I've probably sent 5 tweets in my life. So the easiest place to find me on the web is just at my own homepage, and most of my academic articles are available there. And of course, the ones and ResearchGate, they're mostly available there. Anything that's not available, I'm obviously happy to send people. And the book itself is based on a number of these academic articles. So, for example, the evolutionary psychology of global security, I think that's the title of that paper. That ends up becoming a chapter in the book where I talk about those same issues in a way that's meant to be more accessible.
It's evolutionary psychology and global security. Not to correct you about the title of your own paper, but I happen to have it right in front of me.
Excellent.
So one final question that I'm afraid our audio podcast listeners will not really benefit from the answer to, but what are those artifacts behind you on the wall?
Oh yeah. So these are a trip to Ghana and some masks from Ghana. This is an Aboriginal didgeridoo.
Yeah.
This is a very loose weave carpet from India. This is a painting of Tel Aviv. Okay,
well, that about covers it. All right. Well, Bill, thanks so much. Again, the title of the book is The Social Leap. Thanks for taking the time, and thanks for being up early, even if you didn't do it especially for us.
Totally my pleasure. Lovely to chat with you.
Take care.